Welcome to the Graduated Thoughts Podcast.
You know, usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of, I don't know, extreme, almost comforting precision.
Oh, absolutely. Like a mathematical equation.
Right. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the glowing screen, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's a totally binary system. It's either broken or not broken. It's infected or it's sterile. I mean, we are deeply conditioned to want our ailments to be entirely visible.
Right.
And easily categorized.
Exactly. But then you start reading about the traditions of African-American folk healing, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just entirely useless.
Completely useless.
Yeah, because you realize that looking at health purely through the lens of like a microscope or an imaging machine leaves out massive portions of the actual human experience.
It really does.
So if you, our listener, are approaching this deep dive with a strictly Western biomedical lens, you're going to hit a wall pretty fast. Because we are looking at a diagnostic landscape that operates on a completely different frequency.
Yeah. It requires a massive paradigm shift. I mean, in our dominant cultural framework, when you feel sick, you try to trace it back to a singular, isolated physical cause.
Right, like a germ.
A germ, a virus, a genetic mutation, or, a structural failure in the body. You blame the biology.
Always the biology.
Always. But the system we are exploring today asks a much more complicated question. What if your illness is actually a physical manifestation of a rupture in the relational connections between you, your community, your ancestors, and the universe itself?
Which is just a wild concept to try and wrap your head around at first, but that is the core of what we are unpacking today.
It is.
We are going to trace the origins, the survival, and really the evolution of this distinct healing tradition. And we have a massive stack of source materials on the table today to help us do this.
A really incredible stack of research.
Yeah, we're pulling from Stephanie Y. Mitchum's text, African American Folk Healing, Herbert C. Covey's African American Slave Medicine, along with Mojo Workin, and the Conjure Workbook by Star Casis.
And we also have those primary sources, right?
Yes, the historical interviews from the 1930s WPA slave narratives and the 1970s Wayne State University folklore archives. We are just impartially reporting on what these sources laid out because there are a lot of complex viewpoints in here.
Definitely. And setting the stakes here, this isn't just a history of herbs.
Right.
It's a story of survival, of resistance, and an entirely distinct worldview that allowed enslaved people to basically reclaim their bodies and their humanity when literally every institution around them sought to strip both away.
Yeah, the stakes couldn't be higher. So let's jump in. I was reading Mitchum's text, and she provides a definition of African American folk healing that really stopped me.
A balanced one.
Yes. She describes this practice as a creatively developed range of activities and ideas aimed to balance and renew life.
Which is such a deliberate choice of words, Balance and renew life. She isn't saying cure the disease.
Right. She's talking about restoring equilibrium.
Exactly. Mitchum spends a lot of time analyzing what she terms the epistemological frame of reference. And in this worldview, human life is not an isolated biological machine operating in a vacuum.
Like a car engine.
Right, not a car engine. You are part of an incredibly complex, interconnected web. So illness cannot be exclusively physical. It is fundamentally spiritual and relational.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm fully getting this. She explicitly states that sickness comes from situations that break relational connections.
Yes.
So she means that a feud with a neighbor or a sudden loss or a feeling of deep isolation in your community, these aren't just psychological stressors that maybe give you a headache.
No, not at all.
These ruptures are the illness itself.
Precisely. The rupture is the disease.
Yeah.
And those connections extend way beyond just the people currently walking around in your neighborhood.
Okay, so who else is in the web?
The relational web includes the born, the unborn, the dead, and the natural environment. The physical and the spiritual realms aren't separated by a hard boundary in this framework.
They bleed into each other.
They are completely porous. If there is conflict or imbalance in any of those relationships, the resulting friction manifests as physical or mental illness in the individual.
Wow.
So you can have a sick body, sure, but you can also have a sick relationship or a sick community. And the treatment have to address that specific rupture. You just cannot cure a spiritually rooted illness with a purely biological intervention.
Which goes right back to the X-ray analogy from earlier. An X-ray is never, ever going to show you that your connection to your ancestry is fractured.
It can't.
It can't show you that your community is spiritually decaying. And, to understand how this highly sophisticated holistic web developed in the United States, we have to look at what happened during the forced immigration from the African continent.
The Middle Passage.
Yeah. If you are listening to this, you are likely already deeply familiar with the historical and physical horrors of the Middle Passage, the brutalization, the forced assimilation.
The human toll is unimaginable.
But I was reading the source material looking specifically at the botanical and medical losses, and the scale of it is just staggering.
It's a profound, specific type of trauma.
Yeah.
I mean, the transatlantic slave trade intentionally stripped enslaved people of their material culture.
Everything physical was taken.
Right. When you think about a healer in West Africa or the Congo region, their power and their efficacy are deeply, deeply tied to the local flora.
The actual plants around them.
Yeah, they know the specific roots, the barks, the vines, the leaves of their immediate ecosystem. They know how these plants interact with the human body and the spirit world. So when they were forced onto those ships, they were entirely severed from that ecosystem.
Stark Cassis writes about this so viscerally in the Conjure workbook. She talks about the absolute stripping away of humanity on those ships, being inspected like livestock.
It's brutal to read.
It is. But she points out something that completely shifts the narrative from pure victimization to this profound resilience. She writes that the one thing, the absolute only thing that could not be stripped away from them was their internal knowledge.
That internal library of how the universe operates.
Yes.
The epistemological framework we just discussed survived the journey. The specific plants of the African continent were left behind, obviously, but the methodology of how to communicate with nature, how to diagnose a spiritual imbalance, and how to combine the material with the spiritual that crossed the ocean.
It makes me think of someone arriving on a brand new planet.
Maybe that's a good way to look at it.
Like, the hardware is entirely alien, the trees look different, the soil is different, the plants operate differently, but you still have the software running perfectly in your head.
The operating system is intact.
Right. You still have the operating system that tells you how a plant is supposed to interact with the spirit. You just have to spend the time figuring out how to program this alien local flora to run your software.
And that is exactly the mechanism of adaptation. We see this really clearly in the texts, detailing hoodoo root work.
How so?
Well, because many of the Africans brought to the Americas came from the Congo region, the practitioners began this meticulous process of substitution.
Meaning they had to find stand-ins for what they lost.
Exactly. They had to observe the native plants of the American South. They had to experiment with the European garden herbs brought over by the enslavers. And eventually, they even utilized common grocery store spices.
Grocery store spices? Really?
Yeah, all to substitute for the lost African botanicals, while maintaining that distinctly central African conceptual framework.
So it wasn't just, let's start over from scratch. It was, how do we map our existing highly complex medical science onto the Carolinas or Georgia and Louisiana?
Exactly.
And the urgency of figuring out this new local flora wasn't some academic exercise. It was driven by the catastrophic failure and the sheer danger of the medical system they were thrust into.
Oh, the antebellum medical landscape for an enslaved person was an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, Covey's text, African-American Slave Medicine, and Catherine Bankol's historical analyses lay this out in brutal detail.
The white medical establishment of the era was not designed to heal black bodies. I mean, it was designed to maintain a labor force.
Bankol discusses the human/subhuman controversy, which is just critical here. The dominant culture had to socially and scientifically construct the black body as fundamentally different and lesser to justify the institution of slavery.
And that didn't just stay in the realm of politics?
No, it infected the medical science of the day.
It literally dictated the medical science. Because of this constructed subhuman status, white doctors frequently used enslaved people for brutal medical experimentation without anesthesia or consent.
Which is horrifying.
It is. Furthermore, standard medical care from a white physician was really expensive, meaning an enslaver would only call a doctor if the enslaved person's labor was deemed valuable enough to save.
So it was purely a business decision.
Exactly. The medical management of the enslaved was entirely dictated by economic utility, not the Hippocratic Oath.
Which means, if I'm an enslaved person, the very last thing I want is the plantation owner's doctor anywhere near me or my family.
Right, the risk is too high.
The risk of being experimented on or receiving care that is entirely indifferent to my actual suffering is just unacceptable.
Which creates an immediate, desperate vacuum for autonomous healthcare.
They had to step up.
They did. The failure and the danger of white antebellum medicine literally forced the enslaved community to rely on their own internal resources. This is where the folk practitioners, the grannies, the midwives, the root doctors, and the so-called secret doctors emerged not just as healers, but as absolute pillars of survival.
Covey's text goes deep into who these people were, and they didn't have the luxury of formalized medical schools or published journals.
No, none of that.
Their education was an exhaustive, orally transmitted science. They spent years, sometimes decades, quietly studying the woods and the swamps, testing the medicinal properties of leaves, barks, and roots.
And this knowledge base wasn't formed in a vacuum either. One of the most dynamic aspects of this history is the cross-cultural exchange that occurred in the shadows of the plantation economy.
You're talking about the Native American influence.
Yeah. Enslaved Africans and Native Americans were frequently thrust into close proximity, and a profound sharing of botanical knowledge took place.
The sources mention a specific historical figure, John P. Reynolds.
Right?
He was a black healer who explicitly learned a vast majority of his botanical medicine from Native American practitioners. It's fascinating to think about that exchange.
Two marginalized groups sharing survival tactics.
Exactly. You have African practitioners holding the software of their spiritual and medical framework, trading insights with Native Americans who hold centuries of intimate knowledge regarding the local hardware, the native flora of the Americas.
It was a deeply pragmatic synthesis. The folk healers borrowed from Native American ethnobotany. They observed what European herbs were being used in the plantation houses, and they filtered all of this through their African cosmological lens.
So they basically took what worked and adapted it.
Yeah. If a specific root cured a stomachache, they integrated it. But they didn't just use it as a biological chemical, they incorporated it into their holistic system of spiritual intent and natural energy.
And reading through the Works Progress Administration, the WPA slave narratives from the 1930s is where this really comes to life for me.
Those interviews are incredible.
They really are. These are interviews with formerly enslaved people recalling the specific, tangible remedies they used on the plantations. And some of them are incredibly vivid.
Oh, yeah.
Like Janie Landrum from Texas talks about wearing a buckeye on a string around the neck to cure rheumatism.
The buckeye is a classic element.
And for indigestion, the narratives mention wearing a penny on a string around the neck or even saving the inside lining of a chicken gizzard.
Right.
Now, if you look at that purely through our modern X-ray lens, a modern physician would probably laugh and call it pure superstition. But there is a very deliberate mechanism at play here, right?
Oh, absolutely. Let's break down the mechanism of something like the penny on a string, because it's rarely just superstition. It's a multi-layered intervention.
Okay, let's unpack it.
On a physical level, a penny from that era is highly composed of copper and other trace minerals. There is historical and even modern alternative medical belief in the transdermal absorption of copper to ease joint pain or internal inflammation.
So there's an actual physical component.
Yes, but the genius of the folk remedy isn't just the metallurgy.
It's the psychological aspect.
Exactly. Think about the physical presence of a penny tied tightly around your neck. Every time you swallow, every time you move your head, you feel the string.
You feel the metal against your skin.
Right. It acts as a continuous physical focal point. It is a mindfulness tool that constantly directs the patient's internal intent toward healing their digestive tract. It weaponizes the mind-body connection.
That makes perfect sense when you put it like that. Janie Landrum also mentioned treatments for frostbite, smoking the frostbitten heels with pine top or rubbing them with a roasted turnip.
Which is an immediate practical application of heat, drawing out the cold, while the poultice of the turnip or the sap of the pine provides a protective, potentially antibacterial barrier for compromised skin.
But the WPA remedy that absolutely fascinated me, the one I just can't stop thinking about, was for childbirth.
Oh, the axe.
Yes. Janie said that if a woman was having exceptionally hard pains during labor, they would get someone to place an axe under the bed to cut the pains.
This is a powerful image.
It really is. On its face, placing a piece of iron beneath a mattress seems entirely disconnected from the biological process of labor.
Well, this is a textbook example of sympathetic magic. And to understand it, we have to really deconstruct how pain actually works in the human brain.
Okay.
We know from modern neuroscience and sports psychology that pain is not just a straightforward biological signal. It is deeply influenced by anxiety, focus, and perceived control.
Right, the psychological state.
Exactly. The gate control theory of pain suggests that psychological factors can literally open or close the gates in the spinal cord that allow pain signals to reach the brain.
So by placing the axe under the bed, the midwife is basically manipulating the psychological gate.
Yes, exactly. Childbirth in the antebellum era was incredibly dangerous. The anxiety levels would have been astronomical.
Terrifying.
Right. So when the midwife, who is a figure of immense authority and trust, performs a deliberate, powerful ritual, like placing a heavy, sharp iron axe under the bed with the stated intent to cut the pain, it provides the mother with the profound psychological anchor.
It gives her a concrete visual and mental image to focus on during a contraction. Instead of just drowning in the agony, she can visualize the pain hitting the edge of that axe and splitting apart.
And the iron itself also holds massive spiritual significance in many African traditions. It represents strength, protection, and the cutting away of malevolent forces.
So it's multi-layered.
Completely. The midwife is treating the holistic person. She is managing the biology, yes, but she's also establishing and controlling the psychosocial environment of the room, utilizing ritual to lower anxiety, which in turn literally decreases the perception of physical pain.
When you lay it out like that, it's clearly not a primitive superstition. It is an incredibly sophisticated utilization of the placebo effect, biofeedback, and spiritual grounding.
Highly sophisticated.
And the midwives who orchestrated this were deeply respected. The sources indicate they didn't just catch babies, they tested remedies for avoiding birthmarks, they managed abnormal conditions, they were the absolute authorities on life and death in their communities.
The authority of these folk healers is the crucial pivot point in this whole history. Relying on their own practitioners was far more than just a medical choice for the enslaved.
What was it then?
It was one of the only available avenues for profound self-determination. In an economic and social system meticulously engineered to strip them of all bodily autonomy, the act of seeking out a root doctor, trusting your own people's medical science over the enslavers, that was an act of quiet, radical rebellion.
And the enslavers were acutely aware of this power dynamic. The text Mojo work-in details how hoodoo and root work were strictly outlawed on the plantations.
They had to be.
Yeah, the dominant culture didn't ban these practices because they thought they were silly. They banned them because they were terrified of them.
Because knowledge is an alternative power structure.
What?
The enslaver claims absolute authority over the life and death of the enslaved.
Right.
But then there's a root doctor in the quarters who holds the actual power to heal, to curse, to manipulate the environment. That practitioner possesses an influence that the enslaver simply cannot control or co-opt.
The sources are very blunt about the fact that hoodoo wasn't just used for stomach aches and childbirth, it was a tool of justice.
A very potent tool.
Enslaved people were actively utilizing root work to protect themselves from abusive overseers, to ensure a master would be lenient, or, as one text explicitly puts it, to take out some folks.
Because they had no recourse to legal justice. They couldn't take an abusive overseer to court. They couldn't call the police. The state was the apparatus of their oppression.
So they used what they had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Spiritual warfare and botanical intervention became the judicial system. If a practitioner could mix a powder that, when sprinkled in the overseer's boots, caused his feet to swell so badly he couldn't ride his horse, that is a tangible, effective form of justice and protection.
But because it was outlawed, because the enslavers demonized it as witchcraft and savagery, the entire system had to be driven underground.
It had to be hidden.
Right.
Yeah.
If you are caught carrying an axe to a birthing bed or carrying a root to protect yourself, you could be brutally punished. So how do you hide an entire medical and spiritual operating system in plain sight?
You camouflage it within the very system the dominant culture is forcing upon you. You hide it inside Christianity.
Which brings us to the complex terminology and the evolution of hoodoo and conjure. These terms carry so much cultural baggage today.
They really do.
Stephanie Mitchum points out that outside cultures, and even some within the modern Black community, dismiss these practices as demonic, or they confuse them with formalized religions like Haitian voodoo.
It is essential to decouple the reality of the practice from the Hollywood caricatures. Mitchum's definition is extremely clarifying here.
Remind me how she frames it.
She says hoodoo, or conjure, is a set of practices and beliefs that draw on nature and its perceived energies in order to shape preferred conditions. It is heavily focused on pragmatic, earthly results. It is not an inherently evil system. It is a system of survival.
And Star Casas in the Conjure workbook is incredibly direct about the relationship between conjure and religion.
She doesn't mince words.
No, she doesn't. She states definitively that conjure is not a religion per se, but it is deeply, inextricably woven within Christianity and the Bible. This was the most mind-bending part of the research for me.
It's fascinating.
The idea of the Bible functioning not just as a text of moral instruction, but as a literal grimoire, a book of magical power.
The subversion is brilliant. I mean, the enslaved were subjected to forced Christianization. Enslavers would use cherry-picked biblical verses like, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters," to spiritually justify the brutality of the plantation.
They weaponized it.
Right, they wanted the Bible to be a tool of docility. But the enslaved community did not absorb the text passively. They read between the lines, and they recognized the Old Testament in particular as a landscape of immense spiritual power that perfectly mirrored their own African cosmological understanding of the universe.
Casas writes, "The Bible is a book of power. The Bible is the meat of conjure. It is the power behind the work. It's the ultimate camouflage."
It really is.
Imagine the scene. An overseer walks through the quarters and sees an enslaved person deeply engrossed in reading the Book of Psalms or praying fervently with a Bible in their hands.
The overseer thinks, excellent, the indoctrination is working.
Exactly. They are being pious and submissive. What the overseer does not comprehend is that the enslaved person is using that specific psalm as an incantation for protection, or even a hex against the overseer himself.
The enslaver sees religion. The enslaved person is practicing conjure. Let's look at how they reinterpreted specific biblical figures, because it completely shatters the Orthodox Sunday school narratives.
Yeah, let's talk about Moses. In standard Western Christianity, Moses is the great prophet, the lawgiver who freed the Israelites from Egypt. But in the conjure tradition, Casas identifies Moses as the ultimate two-headed conjure worker.
Two-headed is a crucial term in folk healing. It refers to a practitioner who possesses dual vision.
Like seeing two worlds at once.
Exactly. It's someone who can see and operate in the physical natural world and simultaneously navigate the unseen supernatural world.
I was initially stuck on this idea of Moses as a root worker. How do you take this patriarchal Orthodox prophet and turn him into a conjure man?
You look at what he actually did.
Right. The text points out that God literally gave Moses a conjure stick. When Moses goes before the Pharaoh, who is the ultimate enslaver, he throws his stick on the ground, and it turns into a snake to swallow the snakes of the Pharaoh's magicians.
And in the Hoodoo tradition, that isn't just a divine miracle. That is high-level conjure.
Right. When he parts the Red Sea to let his people escape, that is the ultimate act of defense work and road opening.
They evaluated Moses based on his actions and his access to natural power, not the Orthodox theology of the enslaver. And the practical application of this belief is fascinating.
How is he petitioned today?
Casas explains that in modern conjure, Moses is actively petitioned for cleansing, for uncrossing a hex, and for heavy reversal work. If you feel that someone is spiritually holding you down, you don't just pray a quiet prayer. You call on the specific energy of Moses the conjure worker.
And the rituals are incredibly tactile. You don't just ask Moses for help. Casas details how a practitioner might craft their own conjure stick, cutting a 4-foot tree limb, stripping the bark, curing it, and anointing it with olive oil while praying Psalm 23.
Very hands-on.
Yeah, you physically tap that stick on the floor 3 times to call his power into the room. It makes the Bible an interactive physical tool.
It democratizes the spiritual power. You don't need a priest in a massive cathedral to access the divine. You need a stick, olive oil, the Psalms, and your own spiritual intent.
Moses isn't the only one, though. The prophet Elijah is another massive figure. In the biblical text, Elijah calls down fire from heaven to consume his altar and defeat the priests of Baal. He is a fiery, uncompromising figure.
Very intense.
So in conjure, Elijah's the one you petition when things need to get aggressive. If you need to do reversal work, or what Casas calls nailing down an enemy.
And the physical components used to petition Elijah reflect that biblical fire. Casas notes that offerings for Elijah might involve whiskey, which obviously burns.
Right.
But for intense defensive work, she details a ritual involving gunpowder or an M60 explosive like a literal firecracker.
That part was wild to read. To stop an enemy from harming you, you might take the ash of a burned photograph of your enemy, load it into a firecracker, take it to a crossroads or a stop sign, and physically blow it up while petitioning Elijah to bring their actions to a complete halt.
Let's examine the mechanism of that ritual, because it's brilliant. You are a marginalized person dealing with a threat you cannot legally fight. The anxiety is
I
paralyzed.
feel totally helpless.
Exactly. But when you engage in this highly structured ritual, gathering the ash, invoking the fiery prophet Elijah, going to a crossroads, which is historically a place of spiritual intersection, and creating a violent percussive explosion, you are enacting a profound psychological severance.
It externalizes the feeling.
Yes. The physical explosion externalizes and finalizes your internal intent to stop the enemy. It's a powerful psychological reset for the practitioner, moving them from a state of helpless victimhood to active, empowered defense.
It totally reframes the concept of a spell. It's an action that shifts reality by shifting the practitioner's psychological posture. And then there is the prophet Isaiah. He is utilized for the work of confusion. If someone is harassing you and will not leave you alone, you petition Isaiah. But why Isaiah? What is the connection there?
Well, in the biblical text, Isaiah is frequently prophesying the downfall of Israel's enemies, often speaking about God bringing blindness, madness, and deep confusion to those who oppress the righteous.
Oh, okay.
The conjure tradition extracts that specific energetic signature.
And the ritual matches that energy perfectly. You take a medicine bottle, wash it in harsh vinegar. You literally burn the words of Isaiah chapter 6 into the glass. Then you fill it with black mustard seeds, sulfur, and gunpowder, petitioning Isaiah to scramble the mind of your enemies so they leave you alone.
It's incredibly evocative.
The sensory elements, vinegar, sulfur, gunpowder, they're harsh, chaotic, and volatile, perfectly mirroring the intended effect of confusion.
It is an incredibly coherent system of sympathetic magic mapped onto biblical scripture. But it is vital to note that this tradition is not exclusively about defense or hexing. There is immense beauty in the healing and protection work, too.
Absolutely. Like Mother Mary is heavily petitioned for protection. Cases describes creating a protection bottle by burning the words of Isaiah 43, then adding frankincense, a root called devil's shoestring, and olive oil, all while praying to Mary.
Devil's shoestring is a classic hoodoo botanical.
What does it look like?
It's a long, tough root that physically resembles shoestrings. In sympathetic magic, you use it to trip up the devil, to bind evil, or to tie down protection around your home.
That's so literal. I love it.
Right. Combining that indigenous root with frankincense, which has ancient biblical associations, and dedicating it to Mother Mary is just the perfect example of this hybridized syncretic tradition.
And St. Peter is another favorite. He famously holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven in Christian iconography. In Conjure, those keys are taken quite literally. He is the keeper of all gates, doors, and roads.
Yeah, he opens the way.
If you are stuck in life, if you need a job, if you need a path to open up, you petition St. Peter.
The road opening ritual involves crossing two physical skeleton keys over each other, wrapping them in green string to symbolize growth or money, placing them under running water to cleanse the path, and then keeping them near your front door.
And you have to maintain the relationship, right?
Yes, you maintain the relationship with St. Peter by leaving small offerings, sugar water to sweeten the path, a penny, and reciting Psalm 23.
Looking at all of this, the altars, the specific offerings to saints and prophets, the structured prayers, it raises a very obvious question for anyone studying this from the outside. If you have altars, saints, and prayers, how is this not a formalized religion?
It is a blurry line, for sure, but the distinction lies in the ultimate goal and the organizational structure. Religions typically have a centralized dogma, a hierarchy of priests or pastors, and a primary focus on the afterlife, salvation, and moral theology.
Whereas Conjure is more immediate.
Right. Conjure and folk healing are relentlessly focused on the pragmatic realities of the present moment.
Casas says it beautifully. It was incorporated into the mundane aspects of everyday life. It dictated how they swept their yards to keep away bad energy, or how they threw out old dishwater so as not to offend the spirits.
It's about surviving Tuesday.
Exactly. It's about getting enough money to pay the rent this month, ensuring your partner remains faithful, keeping the police away from your door, and healing a fever. It requires deep faith, yes, but it is a technology for living, not a dogma for dying.
And the bedrock of that technology, the foundation upon which all the biblical subversion and botanical knowledge rests, is the relationship with the ancestors, serving the dead.
The sources make it clear that the ancestors are not just memories, they are active, present intermediaries.
They are very much involved.
Right. They have a vested, ongoing interest in the survival and the prosperity of their lineage. Casas writes that the practice of serving ancestors stems from the absolute belief that their spirits continue to dwell in the natural world, possessing the power to directly influence the fate of the living.
You are never truly alone. The relational web we discussed at the beginning, the idea that health is balance, relies heavily on maintaining an active dialogue with those who came before you.
You literally invoke them by bloodline. The text gives the invocation, "Blood of my blood, I call on those of my ancestors who are willing to come to my aid."
But this isn't taken lightly.
No, not at all. There are incredibly strict, specific rules about how you interact with the dead and how you maintain an ancestor altar.
The physical practices are highly deliberate because dealing with the spirit world requires firm boundaries. For example, a practitioner will never place salt on an ancestor altar.
Why is that? What does salt do to the spirits?
Well, in many global folk traditions, and specifically in Hunu, salt is a grounding, preserving, and purifying agent. It anchors things to the physical, earthly realm.
Which is the opposite of a spirit.
Exactly. Spirits, by definition, are ethereal. Salt repels them or traps them. If you want the ancestors to visit freely and commune with you, you cannot use salt. Instead, you offer cool water, which serves as a conductive medium for spirit.
There is also a very strict rule about photography, right? You never, ever place a picture of a living person on an ancestor altar alongside pictures of the deceased.
That is a critical psychological and spiritual boundary. The elders warn that if you place the living among the dead, it causes confusion.
It blurs the lines.
Right. It makes the ancestors hunger for the company of that living person, which could inadvertently draw them toward an early death. It is a way of maintaining a healthy respect for mortality.
You keep the realms separate.
Yes, you honor the dead, but you do not blend their realm with the realm of the living. You use a white cloth for purity, cool water, perhaps graveyard dirt gathered respectfully from a loved one's grave to serve as a physical anchor for their specific spirit.
And you face the altar to the east, right? Toward the rising sun, symbolizing continuous renewal.
Always to the east.
Understanding this deeply rooted, highly structured system makes the next phase of our historical timeline even more remarkable. After emancipation, as we move into the 20th century, the social landscape of Black America undergoes a massive upheaval.
The Great Migration.
Right. We've been looking at the WPA narratives from the rural South in the 1930s, but the archive materials from Wayne State University in the 1970s track a completely different environment.
Millions of African Americans left the agrarian South, fleeing Jim Crow terrorism and seeking industrial jobs in northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Philadelphia.
And when they moved, the healing traditions traveled with them.
They absolutely did.
But the environment was completely different. I mean, you aren't living next to a swamp where you can forage for devil's shoestring. You are living in a concrete tenement in Detroit, working on an auto assembly line. How does a nature-based folk medicine survive in a metropolis?
It survives through the concept of hybridity, which is a term Mitchum relies on heavily in her book.
Hybridity.
Yeah. Modern folk healing doesn't require lifting a 19th century plantation practice whole cloth and forcing it into a 1970s urban environment. You aren't going to find an auto worker treating frostbite with a roasted turnip.
Right. That wouldn't make sense.
Hybridity means that the fine strands, the spiritual intent, the relational worldview, what Mitchum calls the spirit rather than the letter of the practice, transfers and adapts.
So the mindset remains completely intact, but the material applications evolve based on what is available.
Exactly.
This raises a crucial question that I think many listeners might be pondering. Why, in the late 20th and now the 21st century, with access to modern hospitals, antibiotics, and advanced pharmaceuticals, do people continue to utilize hoodoo, root work, and folk healing? Why hasn't it just faded into history?
Mitchum outlines 8 very specific reasons for its continuation, and they are deeply tied to the ongoing social and medical realities of Black Americans.
What's the first one?
The first is social marginalization.
Mm.
When community is systematically pushed to the margins, access to high-quality institutional medicine is often hindered by geography, extreme cost, or lack of insurance.
And the second reason she lists is cultural hybridity, which we just covered. The ability of the tradition to absorb new elements and remain relevant. But the third reason is massive, and it echoes the history we discussed earlier.
The ongoing racism within institutional biomedicine.
Yes.
This point cannot be overstated. We discussed the human-subhuman controversy during slavery, where medical science was weaponized against Black bodies. That legacy did not evaporate with emancipation.
It evolved.
Sadly, yes. Historically, and continuing right into the present day, the medical establishment has a well-documented track record of dismissing the pain of Black patients, underdiagnosing conditions, and failing to provide equitable care.
So trust is understandably broken.
Completely. When the institutional system continuously proves itself to be unsafe or unresponsive, a community will naturally maintain its reliance on internal, culturally competent healers.
Furthermore, even when modern medicine is accessible and unbiased, its fundamental approach often clashes with the Black cultural conceptualization of holistic wellness.
The siloed approach of modern medicine.
Right. Institutional medicine is highly compartmentalized. You see a cardiologist for your heart, a neurologist for your brain, a psychiatrist for your mood. It isolates the symptoms. But if you hold the worldview that you are sick because of a spiritual imbalance or a fractured relationship, a doctor handing you a pill to lower your blood pressure is only treating the symptom.
Not the root cause. The biomedical model cures the biology, but it leaves the spirit entirely untreated.
What are the other reasons?
Well, the fourth reason for continuation is the adaptation of practices based on available materials. The fifth is commerce, which is fascinating.
Commerce, like buying and selling.
Yeah. As people moved to cities and lost access to foraging in the woods, a massive commercial network of spiritual supply stores sprang up to provide the roots, the oils, and the candles.
Mitchum gives an incredibly vivid modern example of this commerce in her book. She describes a spiritual supplies and services store located in Columbia, South Carolina. It is called the Sphinx Paw.
The name itself is a brilliant piece of hybridity. It draws on ancient Egyptian imagery, instantly connecting the urban American storefront back to the power and mystery of the African continent.
And the signage outside the store is this beautiful, chaotic mashup of the global and the local, the ancient and the modern. It aggressively advertises weight loss and detox products, which are, the most contemporary modern health anxieties you can think of.
Very modern.
But the ingredients it touts are totally globalized. It sells hoodia, sourced from the African continent, goji berries imported from the Himalayas, and mangosteen from East Asia.
It's tapping right into the global wellness market. But what sits right alongside the Himalayan goji berries on their list of services.
Right next to the detox teas, it advertises services for juju and demon slaying.
Which is just incredible. That storefront perfectly encapsulates the modern era of African-American folk healing. It refuses to be trapped in the past.
It addresses contemporary physical anxieties like weight control. It leverages a globalized supply chain for its botanicals, but it proudly and explicitly self-identifies as a Black cultural practice rooted in spiritual warfare, juju, and holistic healing.
It is a living, breathing tradition. The sixth reason Mitchum lists is pragmatism. The seventh is efficacy. Quite simply, people continue to use these practices because, within their cultural context, they yield results. They work.
And the eighth.
The eighth reason is the holistic approach itself, the down-to-earth, familial way that this culture is transmitted across generations.
As we look at the tradition today, we see that it has expanded beyond individual survival and personal health. Folk healing is increasingly deployed as a tool for collective struggle and communal healing.
The text Mojo Workin highlights this evolution powerfully. The author explicitly dedicates the work to those who treated the crack epidemic of the 1990s with hoodoo medicine.
Which is a whole different scale of healing.
Yeah, the book details modern practitioners who engage in the ritual of literally chewing the root on behalf of all those who were unjustly incarcerated during the war on drugs.
That is a profound adaptation of the practice. We see the exact same spiritual framework that an enslaved person used in 1850 to protect themselves from the violence of an overseer being adapted by their descendants in the late 20th century to protect their community from the systemic violence of the modern justice system and the devastation of drug epidemics.
They view mass incarceration and addiction not merely as political or legal issues, but as massive spiritual illnesses afflicting their community. And they are fighting back with the ancestral tools they possess.
It is an unbroken chain of resistance and care. When you step back and look at the entirety of this history, from the shores of West Africa to the antebellum plantations to the modern streets of Detroit and South Carolina, the sheer magnitude of what this tradition represents is just awe-inspiring.
If we synthesize the core truth of everything we have explored today, it is that African-American folk healing is a monument to unimaginable human resilience.
It fundamentally shifts how you have to view the concept of alternative medicine. This wasn't a lifestyle trend.
No, not at all.
This was a marginalized people, stripped of their homes, their languages, and their native ecosystems, who utilized the unbreakable software of their ancestral worldview. They took the unfamiliar plants at their feet, they collaborated with Native Americans, and they even took the very religious texts handed to them by their oppressors, and they forged a totally unique, brilliant system of medical and spiritual survival.
It challenges you, the listener, to expand your definition of healthcare. It is a powerful reminder that for centuries, true healing has not just been about clinical biology. It has been deeply communal.
And inextricably spiritual.
Yes. Fundamentally, it is about identifying and restoring the broken relationships in our lives, rather than just suppressing a physical symptom.
I keep coming back to that X-ray machine we discussed in the first few minutes. The Western obsession with a clean, visible, strictly biological diagnosis. It's incredibly effective at fixing a broken bone, but it is utterly blind to a broken spirit.
It is the perfect metaphor for the limitations of our dominant medical culture. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, a question that builds on the tension between these two worldviews.
What's the question?
In our modern rush to embrace the miracles of institutional biomedicine, to build ever more precise X-ray machines, and to formulate a pill for every isolated physical discomfort, we have achieved undeniable wonders.
We have.
We have largely cured the biological body of ancient devastating ailments. But by so thoroughly abandoning the holistic relational mindset of the folk healer, by discarding the fundamental idea that you cannot be truly well if your connection to your community, your environment, and your ancestors is fractured, what unseen, undiagnosable illnesses of the spirit have we accidentally allowed to thrive in our modern world?